Hi, my name is Erin Stratton, and this is a presentation narrated to discuss test construction and analysis. The presentation objectives include increasing your test construction knowledge, increasing your question construction knowledge as well as skills, increasing your item analysis skills in the hopes to decrease the anxiety associated with test development. And I typically like to divide up the presentation into before the exam, during the exam, and after the exam. And please know that the process of developing, scoring, and analyzing exams is very complex and it can be overwhelming. Best advice is to reach out to your mentor or to someone who has more experience if you need help. And also throughout this process, throughout this PowerPoint, there are resources referred to if you would like to seek those out. And it would be impossible to cover everything in this PowerPoint. So I highly encourage you to find additional sources of help if you are struggling in one specific area. So before the test starts, there are a few things that you want to know about. First of all, most importantly, there's the facility testing policy, and this can include instructions for test development, timing, test security, and maybe even includes a testing committee evaluation of the exam before it's given. Next, you need to know, what is the purpose of giving the exam? Is it a formative or summative purpose? Then you want to look at your objectives for the content included in the test. Your questions need to reflect those objectives. Then you need to kind of figure out, how are you going to do that? You may ask multiple choice questions. There are fill in the blank questions, essay questions, as well as multiple response questions. Also, where will you get those questions from? Are they going to come from a test bank? Are they going to come from previous tests that were given? Are you going to write them? And lastly, exam software is used by a lot of programs nowadays, so you need to become familiar with that. The software, I will admit, is very intimidating initially, but you will eventually be very grateful for the time that you've invested in it. There's a really high return on investment on the time that you spend with that. This test software can help you compile a test. It can help you score the exam. It can also provide item analysis for you, as well as a test blueprint. And that test blueprint is very important because this is going to be what you look at to prove that you have gone back and you have correctly asked the questions over the test objectives or the unit objectives that you wanted to cover. And this test blueprint can also be provided to the students in order to demonstrate to them what will be included on the test. And additionally, and we'll touch on this a little bit further, but we know that we want an exam to be valid and reliable. And this is really the first step in that process of making sure that those evaluation techniques of testing is a valid and reliable method. So also, you want to look at your question type after you have your blueprint. You're ready to start compiling your test questions. And whatever type question you have, you need to have a rationale for each question, each distractor, and correct answer. And this also includes the reference. Sometimes you may have students who come back into you and they're going to ask questions about the exam, and it's always very helpful to be able to go back and look up the exact rationale during that time as well. The NCLEX is composed of alternative type items such as fill in the blank, point and click, multiple response, chart and exhibit, as well as drag and drop. And a lot of the instruction that's given in this presentation can also be used for the development of those questions. According to Morrison, Nybert, and Flick, All test questions should require multi-logical thinking and should be above Bloom's cognitive level, and they should ideally be at the application level or above. And that's demonstrated in this slide. And Morrison, Nybert, and Flick, when you look at this Bloom's taxonomy, they have words associated with different types or the different levels here. And so, for example, if you're looking at the application level, that's going to include questions with wording such as apply, calculate, classify, develop, examine, generalize, illustrate, show, or solve in the use. And in that application, you're asking students to take the information that they know and use it in different ways. So as you move up in the level of difficulty using Bloom's taxonomy, the students are going to be required to take the information that they know and use it in different ways. Excuse me. So that's Bloom's. So questions are composed of a stem, which asks the question or presents the problem, and the options include the distractors, which are not the correct answer, as well as the correct answer. So it's best to compose the stem as a question. That is the preferred way. If that doesn't work, you may compose the question so that it asks the option or uses the completion option for that stem. You want to make sure that you don't use the same words in the options as used in the stem. And when you ask what the nurse will do first, make sure that all those options are correct. So if you're asking a student to pick which option they're going to do first, or what is the priority, make sure that all of those options included following that stem are correct. So continuing on in question construction, you want to stay away from naming the nurse and or the patient and instead use the nurse as in the stem, or for the patient, maybe a patient who is diabetic, for example. Make sure that all the verbs are the same tense and that you use first person language. Also, all questions should be independent of each other. You don't want a student to have to go back and forth. Maybe if they're looking at question 15, they should not be going back to question 14 to answer question 15. And all of these come from Morrison, Nybert, and Flick. So I've included an example here, and you will see very clearly the stem includes the nurse. It doesn't have a specific name for the nurse, and it refers to a patient in the hospital who has a history of IV drug use. It doesn't include a proper name such as Doug. And it asks the question of which disorder is it important that the nurse assess for and provide education. So it's asking a specific question. It is not a completion stem. Now, coming down to the options, which includes the distractors and the correct answer following the stem, all distractors and options should all be plausible, and they should be placed in a logical order. When you look at the validity and reliability of an exam, when you have the options or distractor and correct answers that are not that there's very clearly those that are not the right answer. So say, for example, you have 4 options there listed, and option A is definitely, students are very easily able to pick up that that option is not the correct answer. That takes away from the validity of that exam. So you want to try to make sure that you have 4 or 5 plausible options. You want to make sure that they're all presented in approximately the same length. You want to make sure that you're not using all of the above or none of the above, okay? And another thing that research has shown us is that you want to really make sure that you randomize correct answers. Faculty members have the bad habit of making the same correct answer the same answer. So it'll always be answer A or always answer C. So make sure that you randomize those and know multiple questions. And this also comes from Morrison, Nibert, and Flick. So in the options example here, we have the same stem that was provided before. And in our options here, you can see that they're all approximately the same length. They all end in itis. But, however, the student has to use a high level of discrimination in order to decide what is the correct answer. We know that ulcerative colitis is not associated with IV drug use, and it's also an autoimmune. So a student's going to have to know a little bit about ulcerative colitis as well as IV drug use association with other disorders. Acute bronchitis is not associated with IV drug use, and the same thing for pancreatitis. And so we're going to go with option D, or the fourth option here, which is infective endocarditis. So you can see that all of the options that are presented here are plausible, and we picked option D, or number 4. Now, when you're also constructing your exam, there are a few other things that you want to pay attention to. First and foremost, you want to make sure that your exam questions are free of errors. You also want to make sure that they are numbered properly. So if you're using testing software, a lot of this is going to be pointed out to you. The questions, you can ask the software to randomize the options. You can also ask them to compile different formats of the exam. So someone may have format A, someone may have format B, so that the questions are randomized, basically for exam security. But it'll also let you know that whatever words are misspelled, it will highlight those for you. So you want to make sure that your exam is free of errors. Even though you may be using software, you still want to go back through your exam, okay? Also, you want to make sure that you have the correct number of copies for the exam if you're giving a paper exam. Obviously, it's difficult to hand out an exam, take the exam back if you don't have the correct number of copies. And for exam security, you need to make sure that the exams are kept in a locked cabinet. And this should all be included in your testing policy. So during the test, you have to know that a lot of times there's a lot of nervous energy in the room. If you're a new faculty member, this can be overwhelming all on its own, and it can also, I feel like, cause a lot of anxiety on the part of the faculty member giving the exam. So just make sure that you are very familiar with your testing policy. And one thing that may include is an extra proctor for the exam. So make sure that you follow that. Your exam or testing policy might also include other things, such as making sure that your students have a Scantron that you have examined. It may include making sure that students don't wear hoodies. There are certain things, maybe students are not allowed to have a drink on their desks. So please make sure that you follow the testing policy in order to maintain your testing security. Now, for after the test, as soon as the exam is finished, you want to make sure that you have gathered all the test copies if you are using paper copies. Obviously, if you are using electronic software in order to provide your exam to your students, this is not a necessity. The next step is to complete the scoring, and that includes your test item analysis. We'll get specifically into that test item analysis, and I used this in the software where it comes down and it makes that heavy impact, because I really wanted to impress upon you the impact that using these statistics and using item analysis makes in the effectiveness of your exam, and in the effectiveness of the test questions in giving you valid and reliable data as to what those questions mean, how much your students have learned, and how much of your objectives you were able to accomplish. So in order to do that, this first slide tells you that you're going to look at your mean, median, and your standard deviation. Okay, so these are just basically the very basics of your statistics. We know that mean is the average score, where you've combined all of the scores divided by the number of test takers. We know that the median is the middle of the scores if you divided the group in halves. And we know that the standard deviation is the variability of the group's scores around the mean. So look at that. Is there a greater variability in that standard deviation, or do most of the scores cluster around the group mean? Following that, you have the correct group response, or the p-value. So essentially, this is the number or the percentage of students that got a question correct. So think of the two ends of that. If you have a 0% got that, we know that no one was able to get that question correct. And if we have 100%, we know that everyone chose the correct answer for that question. Morrison, Nibert, and Flick recommend that anything below 30 and anything that is above 90 be evaluated. So basically, maybe the students didn't understand the content as it was described or it was covered in class. Maybe there was something wrong with that question, but you need to go back and you need to look at that question. Maybe that question was something where you expected 100% of the students to get that right. Maybe there was a basic question that was asked and that you elicited and you were hoping for 100% of that response, which is every question, but maybe it was something very basic. Okay, there comes that animation again that really tells you how important all of the information in the test item analysis is in really forming a solid foundation for your exam testing processes. So on this I have upper and lower third. So essentially what you will see whenever I give you the next few slides with the test item analysis examples is that it's divided into the upper, middle, and lower third, and you will see results for the upper third and the lower third. Upper third we can call the high performers, and the lower third of the test takers, we're going to call those the low performers, okay? So essentially that's what you have there. You also have the response frequency. So how for each answer or each option, A, B, C, D, or E, how many test takers or how many students chose that option. And then you have point biserial. That's the correlation between the item score and the overall score, and that's going to range from -1 to +1. So go back to your statistics days and we're going to do a correlation. Your sign goes with correlation. So a positive sign is going to indicate that the high scorers were more likely to answer that question correctly. Now flip it. The negative sign on that point biserial is going to reflect that it was a negative correlation, and instead those who were low scorers were more likely to answer that question correctly. Okay? The higher the point biserial number, the more difficult the question was. And there are different opinions as to what specific number you're going to want in this specific situation. But below 0.2 is considered to be, in some opinions, a poor question. 0.2 to 0.3 is fair. 0.4 to 0.7 is considered good. But if you look at Morrison, Nibert, and Flick, they're going to tell you that a good point biserial is 0.15 and above. And we'll look at some examples of this in just a little bit. Now you have the Kuder-Richardson 20 or the Cronbach Alpha, and primarily in testing you're going to use the Kuder-Richardson 20 or the KR value. We're going to call it the KR, and it can range from 0 to 1. And it reflects the total number of test questions the proportion of response to an item that are correct, the proportion of incorrect responses, and the variance for the set of scores. Okay, and this comes from McGahey and Ball. And Morrison, Nybert, and Flick, they say to strive for a KR at about 0.65 and above. So let's look at an example here. This is from the software PARScore or PARTest. It's two different parts, and PARTest is what you build your test in, and it communicates with PARScore, which provides your test item analysis. If you look at the very top of this, it will tell you that the total possible points that were available were 69, so presumably there were 69 questions. The highest score that somebody received was 60. This is on the far top right. And the lowest score was 47. So your mean score in the middle, second line, was 51.93, and the median score was 51.75. Now, if you look at the reliability coefficient here, KR20, it says it's a 0. Now, I didn't give this exam. I found this example online, so I cannot specifically tell you why. Maybe there's the potential that this exam tested over a wide range of topics, and so therefore the KR wasn't very good. I don't know. But let's look a little bit further down. So this is essentially what you're going to see. And then you have students in the group. There were 15 total that took the exam in this group, okay? Now, if you look down on the left, there are a lot more responses down there for that. So those are the questions. And then you have correct group response. And we're following the columns over. So if you look at number 1, for the first question, you had 80% of the group of those 15 students got that question correct. So that's pretty high. It's between the 30 and the 90 that we discussed earlier. In the upper 27%, so we called that the high performers, 75% of high performing students got that question correct. And the lower 27%, so those are low performers, 75% of those students got that question correct as well. That led a point by serial to 0.08. So, not a great question. It didn't provide a high level of discrimination there. So the correct answer was A. Now, if you follow that table across to the right, under response frequencies, it will tell you, as I stated earlier, how many students answered each response as correct. We know the answer was A. We had 12 students answer A. Option B had 2 students that chose that. C had 0 and D had 1, and it looks like E was 0 if there was an E at all. So the non-distractors on the far right, it will tell you is C and E. So essentially what you want to do, you want to go back, you want to look at this question, you want to look to see, was the question too easy? Did it not have the high discrimination level on Bloom's taxonomy that we expect or that we need in order to make sure that our students have achieved or learned each objective that was asked during the exam? So then you'll go back. We know that that probably wasn't the case because our point by serial was low. And maybe we want to make our options that were our distractors a little bit more plausible. So we'd probably want to go back and definitely look at C, and if there was an E, look at that one, and also look at D. Okay? So you can look down this and see there's a multiple response question, question 30. So you can kind of go back through and look at some of those. Briefly, if I was to just look this over, maybe I've scored my exam, I've run my item analysis. I would just briefly go through here and in my mind know that there are certain questions that I need to look at. Specifically, for example, number 19, I would definitely want to go back and look at. Number 2, it's got 100% correct response. Number 6, let's see if there are any others. Number 30, I would definitely want to look at. And maybe the students are weak in the multiple response items, which looks like what probably happened there. And so you want to increase the student's ability to be test-wise with those types of questions. So that will also help the students perform better. Okay, so another example here, and I pointed this out, number 14. If you look here, you have a 100% correct response. Obviously, the high performers and the low performers all got this question correct. The point by serial was 0.00, so it wasn't a very good question. The difficulty level was probably a little too easy. It didn't pick out. It wasn't very discriminatory between the high and the low performers. Remember, your goal here is to pick out those students who know the knowledge, they know the correct answer, from those who are good guessers or good test takers. If all of your options are not plausible, you will not have very good discrimination between the high performers and the low performers, those that are knowledgeable and those who are good, just simply good test takers and who didn't know the information. Okay, so that's really what this item analysis is telling you. So I'd go back, definitely look at the distractors here. Obviously, they were not written very well. I need to reevaluate that question. Okay, here's another one. Let's look at number 11. You have 66.67% of the class got that answer correct. That's pretty good. 100% of your high performers, so the upper 27% of the class, got that question correct. The low performers on this exam, the lower 27%, only 25% got that question correct. So this was a really good question that was written well enough and provided enough distractors so that only those who had the knowledge to answer the question got that correct. We know that because we can look at the point by serial of 0.46, tells us our correct answer was C. And we also want to look at the distractors. So option number 1 was a very good distractor. The correct answer was 10, and nobody chose B, D, and E. So if we want to, we can go back and we need to look at those distractors, and maybe we want to reword a few things and make those more plausible. Maybe some of them reflected too easily. Maybe there was a positive stem that was given and the distractor was definitely negative. And so the students ideally were able to pick up that that was not the correct option. So following the test, and after your test item analysis, most programs have in their program policy, their testing policy, the percentage that is allowed to be given back to students following item analysis. Now, you have to be very careful, and like I said at the very beginning of this PowerPoint, testing, creating the test, and item analysis is a beast, and it can be very, very overwhelming. So throughout this whole process, you really want to make sure that you are doing it in a quiet space, you are able to reach out to others and ask for help, and that you know your program policy. If you have a question that was 0% of those students got that question correct, make sure that that question was keyed correctly. Maybe the correct answer was D, and you have keyed it to be the correct answer in the software or on the Scantron to be A. So go back and look at those. There's no reason for you to give credit back to students for something like that. If a question was written so that there was more than one answer, and it was a single multiple choice, not a multiple response question, that needs to be evaluated. Just as a tip or word of advice, this is how I have learned to combat a lot of the, first of all, anxiety that students have when they have the exam and they see a problem on the exam. Have kept them from speaking out during the exam or asking questions, and that I have also been allowed to have feedback, was to, if they have a Scantron form, remind the students that, and for me, I feel like when a student asks a question during an exam, it is distracting to everybody around. And it also is distracting to the person who's giving the exam, and so your test security is not the same. So what I've asked students to do is whenever they see a problem with the exam, maybe they feel like it's a poor question, maybe they feel like there is more than one correct response, I ask them to write it out on the Scantron. If they are very, very new students, sometimes I'll say it's okay to write it on the test booklet, but it's really hard to go back through the whole test booklet for every student. So if you just say write it on the Scantron form, you will have that to go back to. And as I score the Scantron form, and I just eyeball and check and make sure that the Scantron form was scored properly, I will also review the back of that Scantron where they are able to write notes. So if I see that a student had trouble with one specific question and I see that over and over, I definitely go back and revisit that question. And I will look at the item analysis for that question. But that keeps students from speaking out in class or raising their hand and distracting others. And it also keeps my focus on exam security and making sure that there's no cheating. And it also provides communication back to me after the exam so that I can gather all the data that I need in order to make sure that it was a good question. So you want to go back and you want to see if there are items that should be deleted from the scores. And finally, you want to take the time to go back and re-examine poorly performing questions. And you want to do that as soon after the exam as possible. If you wait till the end of the semester, sometimes, unless you've written detailed notes, that may not be as fresh in your mind. And that is the end of this presentation. For additional references, please look at these that are included. The majority of this information has come from the Nurse Educator's Guide to Assessing Learning Outcomes, as well as Critical Thinking and Test Item Writing. There are additional resources that are posted throughout the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you so much.